scientist and a mediator. And what I want to talk to you tonight is, I want to talk to you about racial reconciliation. And we're going to focus mostly on black-white relations here in the context of the United States, but much of what follows can be applied more broadly as well. Issues of race in the U.S. can be so difficult, I think, because in any given exchange, there's a reality that we observe on the surface, and there's a dense substratum of meaning and insecurity that is really lodged beneath that surface. And so what I want to do today is I want to tell a simple story. First, we're going to focus solely on surface level detail. And then we're going to take a moment and step back and dive beneath that surface and look at the meaning, social historical meaning that lay beneath that surface. And finally, we want to talk about some of the ways that understanding that substratum of meaning can help us engage one another in more productive ways. All right? So, let's start off by talking about a guy named Skip. Now imagine you're Skip, and you arrive home one day. You arrive home early from a work trip. You cut your trip short because of illness. So you're sick, you're tired from your travels. You get to your front door of your home, and the door is stuck. So you have to shoulder your way in. So you're sick, you're tired, you have to force your way into your home. Shortly after you arrive, the police arrive. Now the police are in your home, and they say they're investigating a burglary, and they want you to show them some identification and verify that you're the rightful occupant of that dwelling. Now recall, you're sick, you're tired, you had to force your way into your own home, and now you're having to justify your existence there in your own home. The police are there, and they want you to prove that you're not the burglar. You are livid. In fact, you decide to let the police officer have it. You hurl insult at the police officer. You insult the police officer so much that the officer eventually arrests you right there on the front steps of your home. The charge is disorderly conduct. Now, back up just a moment and imagine your name is Jim. You're an officer on patrol. You're driving down the street, and a call comes out over dispatch that there was a suspected burglary in the neighborhood. Now, you're nearby, so you respond. You're just doing your job. When you arrive on the scene, you encounter a man that you suspect is the rightful occupant of the dwelling. But doing your due diligence, you tell the man at the home that you need to see his identification. You need to verify that he's the rightful occupant of the dwelling. He's reluctant to comply. In fact, he starts hurling insults at you. In fact, even though he ultimately shows you his identification, you decide that you don't have to take this disrespect. You arrest him anyway. You arrest him right there on the front steps of his home. Okay? Now, I think we can all understand the basic facts of this situation, but it gets a little bit more complicated. Okay? See, Skip is known to Skip among his friends, but he's actually Dr. Henry Louis Gates, an African American professor of history at Harvard University. Go Harvard, right? And Skip is the man involved in this situation, the citizen involved in this situation. And Jim here is a police officer with the Cambridge, Massachusetts Police Department. He is Sergeant James Crowley of the police department. And this incident made national news in the summer of 2009 when Dr. Gates was arrested by Sergeant Crowley on the front steps of his home, even though he was there in his own home, and on a very vague and nebulous charge of disorderly conduct. This became the first real test of the so-called post-racial America and the early Obama administration. In fact, President Obama had Dr. Gates and Sergeant Crowley to the White House for a beer and what became known as the Beer Summit. So there they are having a beer together. They still don't look very happy to be there together. Now, what on one level, on a surface level, you can think of this incident as a good opportunity to talk about where the appropriate boundary is between a citizen exercising their rights, even their rights to be rude in certain instances, and the law enforcement officials' ability to investigate crime and keep the peace. And on one level, that is certainly an important conversation to be had. On another level, however, we might wonder, why was it that Dr. Gates was so upset? Why did he feel obliged to hurl insults at the police officer? On the other hand, we might also wonder why Sergeant Crowley, why the insults were able to get so under his skin that he made an arrest, even though he had already verified that Dr. Gates was the rightful occupant of that dwelling. In order to understand why some of these racial exchanges can be so difficult, we might want to consider the substratum of insecurity, both black insecurity and white insecurity. And let's say some things about the nature of black insecurity. This is an excerpt from remarks made by Senator James Henry Hammond before the U.S. Senate in 1858. And look at some of the things he says here. He says, "We do not think that whites should be slaves either by law or necessity. Our slaves are black, of another and inferior race. The status in which we have placed them is an elevation. They are elevated from the condition in which God first created them by being made our slaves. None of that race on the whole face of the globe can be compared with the slaves of the South. They are happy, content, unaspiring, and utterly incapable from intellectual weakness ever to give us any trouble by their aspirations." In remarks made before the U.S. Senate, we have a senator from South Carolina here saying blacks are by their very nature inferior, so much so, in fact, that for them to be the slaves of whites is an elevation for them. Consider just a few years later, South Carolina, in what eventually becomes the Civil War, decides to withdraw from the Union. And South Carolina makes it very clear in their Declaration of Secession why it is that they're withdrawing from the Union. They say, "We feel as though the Constitution was a contract in which the most important clause was the one where we get to keep our property and slaves, and the non-slave holding states will leave us alone." They go on to say, These ends it endeavored to accomplish by a federal government, in which each state had separate control over its own institutions. The right of property and slaves was recognized by giving to free persons distinct political rights, by giving them the right to represent, and by stipulating for the rendition of fugitives from labor. In other words, what the Constitution is really all about from the perspective of South Carolina here is it's about returning fugitive slaves, even if they make their way into non-slave holding territory. South Carolina goes on to say, "The ends for which this government was instituted have been defeated, and the government itself has been made destructive of them by the action of the non-slave holding states. Those states have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. They've permitted open establishment among them of societies whose avowed object is to disturb the peace and to anoint the property of the citizens of other states." As far as South Carolina is concerned in this declaration, the real problem is that slaves are not only naturally inferior, but that the whole constitutional order that we established under the Constitution, the main design, as far as South Carolina is concerned, is to keep the slaves just that, enslaved. South Carolina feels strongly enough about it that they go on to say, "We therefore, the people of South Carolina, by our delegates and convention assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, have solemnly declared that the union heretofore existing between this state and other states of North America is dissolved. This is an important enough issue that it needs to lead to the dissolution of the union rather than to relinquish the slaves. In fact, they appeal to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of their intentions. This is good and right as far as South Carolina is concerned." So notice that even 100 years after the Civil War, as we might imagine, it is not the case that simply because the law is changed and enslaved persons are now legally freed and now elevated to co-equal legal status with the majority white population, it is not the case that many of these folks who believe in the rectitude of their intentions just accept the new reality and go and start treating black Americans as co-equal partners in this great country. No, you might imagine that there's a lot of bitter resentment. You might imagine that going forward, there's a sort of resentment that is created from the idea that you could elevate, in legal terms, those whom we regard as our rightful, our natural inferiors. And so for generations following the Civil War, you still see this resentment manifest itself in different ways, and you still see both law and custom both conspiring to keep the previously enslaved persons and their children in their rightful place. And you might imagine what this sort of sentiment does to the black population. Consider what that does to that population over subsequent generations. Here is an excerpt from W.B. Du Bois' 1903 book, where he recalls an early childhood experience where some of his playmates, some of his white playmates, first make him aware of the fact that he's different and that he's regarded as somehow an other and inferior to them. He says, "Then it dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, or like, mayhap, in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil." Okay? And we might wonder what effect that has on the psyche of a person. What effect does this have on, for lack of a better term, the black American psyche? Well, Du Bois tells us, he says, "I had thereafter no desire to tear down that veil, to creep through. Rather, I held all beyond it in a common contempt." I think we can imagine what it's like to experience rejection and the natural human response to rejection. We often want to reject those who have rejected us with equal or greater force than that which they rejected us. When someone says, "We don't want you a part of our group. We feel as though you are not worthy to be a part of our group," sometimes our response is to say, "Well, I don't want to be a part of your group. In fact, maybe I will do all sorts of things to indicate that I don't want to be a part of you." Right? Maybe in many different ways, and adopting different patterns of speech, patterns of dress, patterns of behavior, maybe I want to indicate that there is no way on the face of this planet that I want to belong with you. Imagine this sense of rejection and this sense of wanting. It's a humiliation to be rejected. It's yet a further humiliation to long for, or to appear to long for, acceptance in a group that has rejected you. So black insecurity might be somewhat easy to understand. Might be easier to understand than the nature of white insecurity. We might say white Americans are the putative masters of the Western world. What do they have to be insecure about? But therein, I think, lays some of the issue. As the putative masters of the Western world, any criticisms that we have of the West and of America in particular become criticisms of the white majority population. Consider the feminist movement, which at its heart says that men are not the measure of all things, and many abuses have been suffered by women at the hands of men. Consider the anti-war movement, which says at its heart that perhaps the projection of American force abroad has not been a force primarily for good. Perhaps it's been destructive and abusive. Perhaps we've abused the world in the projection of our power. Consider the environmental movement, which says that much of our lauded economic growth may have come at the expense of our environment. Maybe we've degraded the planet, so we've abused not only maybe the peoples of the world, but the planet itself. And of course, consider the civil rights movement, right? Which at its core, if you think about some of the speeches of Martin Luther King, for example, Think about the I Have a Dream speech, where he makes reference to the Declaration of Independence and those promises of freedom and justice and equality. And think how he attempts to shame the nation to live up to some of his highest aspirations. Notice what each of these movements have in common is that over the last several generations, what they've done is they've lodged a fundamental critique of American culture, of our society. And they've said, maybe some of that American self-confidence is misplaced. Maybe we are not so great as we think we are. You think that might make the masters of this society feel a little bit insecure? Perhaps. Here's a notable recent example. Colin Kaepernick decided to protest the treatment of blacks at the hands of police officers by kneeling and refusing to render honor to either the American flag or the national anthem. And he said he will refuse to do so until such time as justice has been done in the issue he wants to bring awareness to. And think about the national dialogue, much of it negative, that was sparked by this particular action. Colin perhaps tapped into this sentiment that we've been discussing.
According to Black Twitter, and I call it Black Twitter because that's what they refer to themselves as, by the way, black songs about black struggle, black culture, or black features should be off limits to the melanin deprived. Wait, what? Now songs are off limits too? Can white people do anything anymore?
Can white people do anything anymore? And of course, these remarks by Tommy Lauren are perhaps easy to laugh at in the way that she expressed them, and yet the sentiment is something that is very indicative of what we're talking about. There's a notion among many white Americans of, can I do anything? Can I say anything without bringing blame or shame or disrepute upon myself? Is there anything that I can say and not be somehow maligned for it? Now, we might say that if the nature of black insecurity at its core is a matter of, we might call it unrealized dignity, as yet unrealized dignity, then we might say the nature of white insecurity may boil down to maybe a lost dignity or a diminished dignity. And so what I want to call your attention to is, as we return back to Dr. Gates and Sergeant Crowley, you might consider that both of these men had several opportunities during the course of their exchange with one another to de-escalate the situation. That either of them at any point in their exchange with one another could have taken steps to take some of the heat out of their exchange. And yet neither chose to do so, and I posit to you that perhaps neither chose to do so because they're responding to one another out of their competing, and to one another their mutually incomprehensible insecurities. And maybe that made this exchange more volatile than it otherwise would have been. So what can we do to make these situations go more smoothly? Well, for one thing, we can keep in mind, we can realize that often exchanges such as this one are made more difficult because of insecurity. And we can recognize that the other side is responding to us in ways that may appear to us to be hostile, but they really are born out of a deeply ingrained insecurity that maybe they themselves are not even aware of. You see, in this situation, Dr. Gates could not fathom why this was happening to him. And it was all too easy for him to think that this was happening because of his race. And he called Sergeant Crowley a racist. Now, given all the social historical baggage we just talked about, a racist is probably one of the worst things Sergeant Crowley can be called. And he responded out of that. So maybe one of the things we should do is keep in mind that what we're often doing in these exchanges is responding out of our own insecurities. And if we recognize that, we can empathize more with one another. Excuse me. The other thing is to keep this in mind in our approach with one another. I'll give 2 examples. One, think about the Black Lives Matter movement. And in response to apparent abuses of blacks at the hands of police, we may often hear ring out the assertion, Black Lives Matter. Now, we may regard that as a hostile statement, and we might be inclined to respond with, all lives matter. But what I want to get you to see is, if Black Lives Matter arises out of a deeply ingrained sense that perhaps black lives are not considered the equal counterpart to white lives, then responding with all lives matter is non-responsive. It doesn't help. Perhaps affirming that yes, black lives do matter can be helpful. Consider also the Colin Kaepernick protest. And we might think that any form of protest is likely to be viewed in an offensive manner. On the other hand, if we compare Kaepernick's refusal to render honor to the flag and to the anthem, and compare that with Dr. King's positive reference to the Declaration of Independence and the aspirational values embodied in the Declaration, we might see a better way forward. We might think that perhaps Colin could have pointed to some of our common cultural touchstones and the values embodied in those, and called us higher to live out those aspirational values embodied in our national touchstones. Thank you.